What does a relationship look like between a Type 2 helper and a Type 5 investigator? Well, let's start off by talking about a few things they have in common. I always love talking about the shared traits of two Enneagram types that seem so different on the surface, because it provides an opportunity to take a closer look at the shape and systems that form the true Enneagram, and not the recycled collection of stereotypes you'll often find on social media. Speaking of which, if you haven't watched my complete guides to Enneagram 2s and 5s already, then I would highly recommend checking those out first before watching this video, because I'm about to fly through some super complex Enneagram theories that really deserve a deeper conversation than we have time for in this episode. Okay, with that said, the first place that Enneagram 2s and 5s connect is at the Type 8 Challenger via their movements of integration and disintegration. This movement to the more direct, confident, commanding, and often confrontational 8 can surprise people who thought the 2 was just some jovial live, laugh, love kind of wine mom, and the 5 was some nerdy introvert writing code in their basement all day. Well, as it turns out, unhealthy 2s are like bookies, tallying up all the good deeds they've done for you, and when you don't pay your debts, they come to collect, which is why their movement of disintegration is to the Type 8 Challenger. Healthy 5s, on the other hand, collect so much theoretical head knowledge that they eventually decide to test it out in the real physical world. And as it turns out, they can be quite masterful, which then fuels a well-earned sense of confidence. This is what's symbolized by their movement of integration to the high side of the Type 8 Challenger. So essentially, 2s and 5s share an equally dramatic shift to their inner 8-ness, which can honestly be a good or bad thing depending on their situation and their personal level of health. All right, the next place 2s and 5s connect within the Enneagram is at the Type 4 Individualist via the 2's movement of integration and the 5's wing. Now, not all 2-5 couples will have a significant connection here, as the 5 can have a dominant 6 wing. But when 5s do have a strong 4-wing, they often connect with a healthy 2's ability to acknowledge and empathize with the full spectrum of human emotions and not just the light, fluffy ones. In fact, I would bet that a 5-wing 4 would be fairly repulsive to an insecure or unhealthy 2, as their fascination with darker or emotionally evocative subject matters would be like dragging the 2's heart into deep waters without first giving them swimming lessons. All right, speaking of deep waters, the final place 2s and 5s connect within the world of Enneagram theories is in their dominant affect. This one gets pretty nuanced pretty fast, as it's rooted in attachment theory and childhood development. But the short and oversimplified version is that 2s and 5s relationships are primarily influenced by the subtle feeling of rejection. The 2, however, learn to cope with this feeling by leaning into their relationships and trying to get people to need them, while the 5 learn to cope with this feeling by leaning away from their relationships and trying to get people to need nothing from them. Okay, more on that as we go along. And for now, it's time to shift gears and talk about what 2s may find uniquely attractive about 5s and vice versa. If you watched my episode on relationships between Enneagram 2s and 8s, then you already know that 2s are often attracted to people who play hard to get. Well, 5s certainly aren't playing, but they are indeed hard to get. In fact, 5s with a 6-wing are typically the most difficult Enneagram type to reach on an emotional level, as their desire to cultivate a truly secure and objective mental world can make them diminish the value of not only basic human interactions, but also their deep need for love. Thankfully, the 2 is like a drug-sniffing dog at the airport when it comes to sensing even the slightest hint of a heart that's been concealed. And to be honest, 2s kind of love the hunt, because searching and earning love through their valiant acts of service makes way more sense to their ego than just being given love for no reason. Fortunately, 5s as relational minimalists always have a reason for what and who they let into their sacred inner worlds, which then makes the 2 feel incredibly special. Speaking of which, another point of attraction for 2s in this relationship is when the 5 has some uncommon or impressive skill set. Now, that may not sound wildly insightful at first, but the more subtle source of attraction here is the way that 2s derive a deep sense of pride from the quantity or quality of people they love and serve. Therefore, 2s, much like 9s, will attach themselves to impressive partners as a way of gaining affirmation via osmosis. So let's say the 5 has some prominent career that puts them in the public eye or makes them super wealthy. Well, then the 2 gets to feel like, oh wow, I must be pretty great for someone that talented and successful to need me in their life. Furthermore, 5s tend to have a fair amount of trust issues and a far more limited social gas tank than the 2, which in turn allows the 2 to act like a kind of relational ambassador for the 5. This not only makes the 2 feel proud to have access to such an exclusive individual, but also meets their need to be needed because now they have the energizing responsibility of keeping the 5 connected to the outside world. All right, the last point of attraction worth noting for 2s in this relationship is the way that healthy 5s provide them with a calm, calculated sense of direction. Now, if we take a quick look at the 2's triadic pattern, you'll see that they're primarily heart types who integrate their emotions with the physical activity of the gut or body center, and then pretty much ignore the rational thoughts of the head center. That's not to say that 2s can't be incredibly intelligent people. It just means that in general, 2s prefer to act on their feelings, which can then lead to some incredibly loving acts of service, or some super irrational and impulsive responses to emotionally charged situations. Luckily, 5s are firmly in the head center, and since their least developed center is the gut or body center, they rarely, if ever, rush into a situation until it's beyond clear what the best course of action is. So, if the 2 learns to appreciate and integrate the 5's perspective into their decision-making process, then they often develop much healthier boundaries on top of avoiding lots of unnecessary drama. All right, that's a good place to stop and switch over to what typically attracts the 5 to the 2. One major reason 5s are attracted to 2s is because they help the 5 see that life is better together. Now, that's not just a song that every white kid with a deep V-neck learned on the guitar in the early 2000s. And in this context, it's a major shift in the 5's ego narrative that tells them it's easier to navigate this world when you don't get emotionally invested in other people. So, what many 5s become over time is a competent survivalist who takes pride in not needing what everyone else seems to need, i.e., relationships. Now, a lot of this can be tied back to the 5's childhood experience, where they felt crowded out of the family, either because their parents were emotionally unstable and wrapped up in their own drama, or their family simply didn't seem to appreciate the 5's unique interests. This is why many 5s are so driven to cultivate a hyper-specific skill set that not only allows them to provide for themselves, but also gives them a medium through which they can confidently connect with other people. And now we're back to why 2s can be so attractive to 5s, as 2s are not only great at supporting whatever eccentric or super niche focus the 5 has, but are also great at crafting a wonderfully hospitable environment at home where the 5 can feel comfortable leaving their isolated mental hiding places and engaging in a more human connection. Furthermore, 2s are uniquely gifted when it comes to picking up on what the 5 needs, even if they don't actually express those needs out loud. Some Enneagram teachers describe this as emotional attunement, as healthy 2s have this knack for walking into a room and just kind of sensing when something is off with their loved ones. This is what allows them to interpret the often subtle, evasive, or detached demeanor of the 5 with ease, as the 2 recognizes the 5's mental angst or unspoken emotions without needing to have an hour-long heart-to-heart about what's really going on. Now, would the 2 love to have that conversation? Of course. But thankfully, in the desert of emotional connection, the 2 holds out hope for the oasis of intimacy that's sure to come. In fact, 2s are in what's known as the positive outlook group of the harmonic triad, which is all about the way Enneagram types choose to cope with painful situations. Essentially, this means that 2s default to an optimistic perspective whenever life or people hurt their feelings, which makes them great at giving the 5 lots of grace and patience during moments when the 5's demeanor is anything but gentle and loving. Fortunately, the healthy 5s out there are observant enough to recognize and appreciate how the 2 endured their prickly behavior and was still willing to cook them a nice meal, do their laundry, and/or let them pick another obscure documentary to watch. All of which goes a long way in making the 5 feel safe and loved just the way they are. Ultimately, this combination of a generous perspective and generous acts of service is what leads to the deconstruction of the 5's belief that doing life alone is better than doing life together. All right, on that nice note, the 2s may want to hit pause because it's time to move on from these points of attraction and talk about what conflict looks like in a 2-5 relationship. Hey there, friend. Looks like you're a little more than halfway through this Enneagram relationship episode, which means it's a great time to not only watch this fancy little neon graphic float off into the distance, but to hit those like and subscribe buttons, you know? You know what I mean? You know those buttons that are sitting right there? Don't be coy, you know where they are. You know, if you're feeling non-committal, you can just hit the like button. It's still really helpful. Okay, let's get back to it. All right, now that we've reached the section on conflict, I have to admit that most of what I've mentioned as a point of attraction in this relationship can just as easily become a point of contention. So, the two's desire to be with people will clash with the five's desire to be alone. The two's desire to stay positive will clash with the five's desire to stay realistic. And last, but certainly not least, the two's emotional perspective can and will clash with the five's rational perspective. Now, this is all to be expected in any relationship that feels like opposites attract. So, hopefully, it's not too discouraging, because after all, any tension is also an opportunity for growth. All right, with that said, let's talk about the broader pattern of conflict that normally plays out in a 2-5 relationship. Typically, tension is sparked by the 2 initiating contact with the 5, as they're almost always hungrier for relational connection. Now, when 5s are stressed or physically exhausted, their default response is to protect their personal space. And so even if the 2 is genuinely well-meaning in their approach, it can still seem like an enemy invasion, which just makes the 5 withdraw even further away from the 2. This may seem like a cruel thing to do to your loving partner, but in all fairness to the 5, the 2 can be a bit invasive at times, as they often feel too ashamed to ask for what they want directly. And so they kind of hover around looking for some seemingly helpful task they can use to disguise their desire for quality time and attention. The problem is, the 5 is usually way too discerning to be fooled by the 2's ruse of service with no strings attached. And so they don't hesitate to dismiss the 2's help with some cutting remarks. At this point, the really stressed or unhealthy 2s can become enraged by the 5's rejection, as it hits them right in their festering pool of pride that's built up from years of feeling unappreciated by those they serve. Now, this is where we get to see a bit of that connection these types have at the Type 8 challenger that I mentioned earlier, as insecure 2s double down on their aggressive invasion of the 5's personal space, while the 5 feels even more confident in their desire to be alone, as the 2's histrionics prove they're just a disruption to the 5's mental stability. This pattern gets even more intense and confusing thanks to the clash between the 2's desire to remain positive and the 5's desire to remain rational. Now, I could reference several different Enneagram theories here, but the most important one is the harmonic triad I mentioned earlier, as it's all about the way these types cope with painful situations, like a relationship that's on the rocks. 2s, as positive outlook types, don't like to focus on anything too negative, least of all their own behavior. So even after a major conflict, the 2 seems to have no memory of how dramatic their behavior was. 5s, on the other hand, are competency types who don't like to feel incapable of solving a problem. And since emotions make problems much harder to solve, the 5 begins to treat the 2 as dispassionately as possible. This leaves the 2 wondering why the 5 seems so cold and distant, while the 5 feels like the 2 is living in denial. And ultimately, this dynamic should be a big red flag for this couple because it reinforces their deepest insecurities. The 2 feeling unloved no matter how much they give, and the 5 feeling certain that being alone is the only way to protect themselves. All right, now that you know how things can go wrong in this relationship, let's talk about a few things this couple can do to help things go right. When I was thinking about relationship advice for the 2-5 couples out there, I couldn't stop thinking of the phrase, clear eyes, full hearts, can't lose. Now, I know a lot of 5s out there might not be familiar with this line from Friday Night Lights because it's a show about football, but stay with me because this motto is actually a great framework for keeping your relationship on track. Okay, first up is clear eyes, which is just for the 2s, as they're prone to losing sight of what's really going on in their relationships. What I mean is that when 2s feel insecure in a relationship, their instinct is to lean in and do more. But the closer and more involved they get, the more clouded their vision becomes. So what the 2 really needs to practice is stepping away and getting a clear view of not only their own internal motivations, but the true needs of the people they're trying to help. This can and should feel pretty unnatural at first, as it's forcing your heart to check in with your head, rather than just impulsively doing whatever feels right in the moment and then justifying it later on. Unfortunately, this is a surefire way to lose the 5's respect, on top of creating a chaotic atmosphere of emotional decision-making that's like nails on a chalkboard to the 5's rational mind. So, I would highly recommend that the 2 uses some of that alone time the 5 is sure to provide them with to develop a practice of stillness and meditation. This will not only help the 2 develop a clearer sense of self, but will also create a more stable dynamic with the 5, who thrives on calm, intentional interactions. All right, time to move on to full hearts, which is just for the 5s, as it's all about embracing their need for human connection. Now, the reason this is so important is because the more isolated the 5 is, the more empty and cynical their heart becomes. This can then lead to a fairly dark worldview that makes the 5 feel detached not only from their loved ones, but from reality itself. So I would first recommend that fives commit to some kind of regular social activity or community service group that gets them out of their heads and into a social environment, at least for a few hours a week. I would imagine the 2 has more than a few suggestions here. Next, I would recommend finding a safe space where you fives can process your emotions. Oftentimes, the 5's cynical outlook on relational intimacy stems from the fact that growing up, they felt awkward, embarrassed, or just incapable of fitting in with their family. So it's essential that the 5 works through any past heartache and learns that sharing their emotions with other people, like the 2, is actually a gateway to a far more meaningful life experience, as they become an active participant in their life, rather than just a cynical observer. So all that to say, a full heart is as much about the 5 learning to put themselves out there as it is about learning to let people in. All right, that leaves us with the can't lose attitude for this duo, which comes from a shared vision of their future together. For this relationship to work, 2s and 5s both need to agree on what they're building together, because without a shared blueprint, the natural tug of war between their differing perspectives will eventually tear the whole house down. So, about as early as possible, I would recommend that this couple align on things like their political views, their desire for a family, and most importantly, any spiritual or religious beliefs. Lord knows if the 2 has some passionate faith and the 5's got a ton of intellectual disdain for religion, then there's always going to be a huge chasm between them. Now, I'm not saying this couple has to agree on every little thing, but that it's like building a home, where the foundation has to be solid. And then it doesn't matter if every room in the house looks totally different, and the 2 is a chef's kitchen while the 5 has a gaming lounge in the basement. And speaking of playing games in a basement, it's time to wrap things up as we always do with the patented YGAT relationship rating system. First up on the YGAT relationship rating system is the spice meter, and this pairing's definitely got some sneaky heat to it. Not only do they have an intense collision at the Type 8 Challenger with their movements of integration and disintegration, but they also tend to bridge the gap between their hearts and minds with some good old-fashioned physical intimacy. So yeah, let's go with about a 7 out of 10. Next up is the power meter, and this couple can definitely hold their own, as 2s bring the relational or emotional intelligence to match the 5's rational or strategic intelligence. However, the mixture of a withdrawn type and a compliant type means that ambition is often tempered with plenty of, let's say, humble caution. So for that reason, let's put them at about a 4 out of 10. That leaves us with the fun meter, and the 2-5 couple usually prefers the cozy conversations over the crazy adventures. But since they can become great travel partners, thanks to the 5's well-researched itinerary and the 2's game for anything attitude, I'll move them up just a bit to about a 4 out of 10. All right, folks, there you have it, the Enneagram 2-5 relationship. A sneakily spicy, carefully productive duo who may not be the life of the party, but hey, they'll make sure you're well-fed, well-informed, and well-rested, because everybody's got to go home by 9 p.m. Okay? That's a wrap on this Enneagram relationship episode for the Type 2 helper with a Type 5 investigator. If you're shutting it down here, then I will say thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, then please do me a tiny favor and hit those like and subscribe buttons for me on your way out. But hey, if you're sticking around for more Enneagram goodness, then you know I've got plenty of relational themed content for you to choose from right here on the screen, as well as some more lighthearted content if you 2s need a break. Take your pick.